After spending most of the 30s under authoritarian rule, much of Latin America experiences a democratic opening during the 1940s. Although no more than half of the countries in the region will be democracies at any one point in time, democracy will reach approximately 2/3 of the countries in Latin America at some point between 1945 and 1960. And around 75% of the region's population will spend at least some time living under democratic rule during the mid-20th century. While this wave of democratization in Latin America has largely domestic causes, it is helped along by the favorable international environment that prevails after the entry of the United States into World War II. It is useful to the United States government to portray the Second World War as a struggle for freedom and an ideological conflict that pits the democratic nations of the world against the fascism of the Axis. In 1942, the Allies rebranded themselves as the United Nations, a broad multilateral front of countries throughout the world that comes to include several countries in Latin America. The United States government never really promotes democracy in Latin America at this time, but it does briefly become more tolerant of democracy in the region. The United States military interventions in Latin America had already dropped off during the 1930s, but military interventions remain on pause in Latin America throughout the 40s, even as the United States is ramping up its involvement in other parts of the world. This gives domestic democratic movements in Latin America badly needed room to breathe and flourish without the risk of being immediately overthrown by US intervention. Meanwhile, the war also influences Latin America's militaries, and during the 40s, many of the region's militaries developed constitutionalist factions that favor a return to constitutional and elected governments. As World War II draws to a close, the Brazilian army overthrows the 15-year dictatorship of Getúlio Vargas, hastening a transition to democracy that was arguably already underway. In Uruguay, the onset of US involvement in World War II prompts the general and president Alfredo Baldomir to stage a military coup that initiates a transition to democracy in 1942. In Venezuela, reformist sectors of the military joined forces with leftist civilian groups to overthrow the military dictator Medina Angarita in 1945. However, throughout much of the region, the main force behind democratization in the 1940s is not the military, but rather mass democratic movements. In 1944, Guatemala's dictator Jorge Ubico is overthrown in a revolution organized by an alliance between workers and middle-class students. That same year, a nearly 5-decade liberal dictatorship in Ecuador is overthrown by a broad democratic movement that includes workers, Catholic activists, socialists, communists, and conservatives. The new democracies that take root in Latin America during the 40s look very different from the old competitive oligarchies that had governed the region a decade earlier. In most of Latin America, the age of oligarchy is definitively over by the mid-40s. These new democracies of the mid-20th century are true mass democracies. As millions of lower-class citizens flood into the electorate for the first time, the old elites will often find that they are no longer able to control the course of events like they did in the past. Most countries in the region will eventually elect some sort of populist or even leftist government that will enact land reforms, nationalize industries, and carry out various other popular policies that would have been deemed heretically radical just a few decades earlier. The major parties of this era will also represent a much broader swath of society than the elites and middle-class elements that had dominated the parties of the early 20th century. To a large extent, the story of Latin America's mid-20th century democracies is a story about the inclusion and political incorporation of sectors of society that had historically been marginalized and disenfranchised. The labor movement has already been a recurring character in our story for the last 16 videos, but during Latin America's era of mass politics, the labor movement finally joins the main cast as a central protagonist in Latin American politics. As a general rule, the parties that are able to secure the support of organized labor will tend to dominate electoral politics in their countries. The relationship between political parties and labor movements in mid-20th century Latin America can take a variety of different forms. In countries like Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, one party will succeed in monopolizing labor politics in their country, and this will tend to transform the labor movement into a partisan actor that is in the service of that one party. In other countries, the labor movement will become more of a battleground where multiple different parties compete in an attempt to cultivate electoral support among the working class. This can lead to highly pluralistic labor organizations like the Sole Workers Central, or CUT, of Chile, which contained a diverse mix of communists, socialists, anarchists, radicals, and Christian Democrats. But in other countries, the competition between different parties will tend to split the labor movement apart into several separate labor organizations, including some that are tied to particular parties and others that are fiercely independent from partisan politics. While the labor movement is by far the most valuable prize for mid-20th century Latin American parties, other actors in society are also starting to make their voices heard for the first time. In some parts of the region, the peasants will break free from the patron-client ties that kept them bound to conservative parties in the past, and they will start to demand a redistribution of the land to the people who actually work it. In other countries, indigenous peoples will play a much more active role in national politics by the mid-20th century. Communist and nationalist movements alike will seek to mobilize indigenous peasants into revolutionary struggle, and they will become an important constituency for revolutionary governments in countries like Guatemala and Bolivia. By the end of this period, some parties will also attempt to organize the urban poor who reside in shanty towns and who work mostly in the informal sector of the economy. The urban poor will form an important base of support for many of the populist parties of the region, while the older Marxist parties will have to adjust their conception of the working class to account for these large sectors of the population that lie outside of the traditional proletariat. The videos that follow are also going to feature a much more diverse range of parties, including a couple of old ones and many new ones. The main actors on Latin America's traditional Marxist left are now the communist parties of the region. With the exception of the Communist Party of Chile, none of Latin America's communist parties will ever become significant forces in democratic elections, but communists throughout the region are still major players in the labor movement and other social movements. Those early socialist parties that rejected communism and chose to go in a more social democratic direction are still around, but they are never again going to win more than a few percentage points of the vote after the mid-1940s. Instead, most of the energy on the non-communist left now lies with a new generation of left-wing and anti-imperialist populist parties. Some of these populist parties are socialist parties, at least at the moment of their birth, including the Peruvian Apristas and their sister parties, the Chilean Socialists and the Venezuelan Adecos. But these parties are uninterested in simply emulating European socialist parties, and they will work to design a new Latin American socialism that either rejects Marxism or drastically revises it in order to fit Latin America's own unique history and social realities. Other populist parties take a progressive but non-socialist position on economic issues. These parties tend to have weaker ties to organized labor compared to the socialist populist parties, and anti-imperialism often forms a central part of their brand and mass appeal. We are also going to meet a couple of corporatist populist parties, such as the Mexican PRI, the Argentine Peronist Party, and the Brazilian Labor Party. All three of these parties were constructed inside the government, and they developed deep ties to the labor movement through state sponsorship of union organizing while they were in power. Labor leaders in these countries will gain an unprecedented level of representation inside the halls of power. But over time, the relationship between the party and organized labor will often become a one-sided and even abusive relationship that frequently subordinates the interests of labor to the interests of the party. Much later on in this series, we are going to encounter a couple of Christian democratic parties. Like their European counterparts, some of Latin America's Christian democratic parties will quickly become center-right and pro-business political forces. But others will remain anchored to the center-left, and they will come to embrace progressive economic policies like redistributing land to the peasants, anti-poverty programs, and social housing. Some of the traditional parties of the 19th century are still around by Latin America's era of mass politics. Those traditional parties that reorganized themselves as mass-based parties in the early 20th century continue to be among the largest and most successful parties in their countries during the era of mass politics. There is also a second group of traditional parties that remained largely closed to mass participation and are therefore at greater risk of dying out as more voters enter the electorate. Few of these unreconstructed traditional parties will ever hold the presidency again after 1945, though some managed to hold on to a minority of seats in Congress thanks to a combination of clientelism and lingering restrictions on suffrage. They will soon be joined by a new generation of Latin American elite parties. While these parties will make a more conscious effort to build a mass base of support, they will generally resist the democratic organizational changes that we saw take place in traditional parties like the Uruguayan Colorado Party. As a result, this newer generation of elite parties will remain staunchly right-wing, and they will form a bulwark for conservatism in their countries. We are going to begin our tour of Latin America's era of mass politics with the two cases that were the most influential for party building region-wide. First, we will visit post-revolutionary Mexico. We will cover the series of events that prompted the country's disparate revolutionary elite to come together into the National Revolutionary Party. And then we will watch this party transform into the Party of the Mexican Revolution as it incorporates workers and peasants into its ranks. On the second stop of our tour, we will meet Latin America's quintessential opposition party, the American Revolutionary Popular Alliance, or APRA, of Peru. The APRA will attempt to win power by building a very similar multi-class coalition of peasants, workers, and members of the middle class. Although its path into presidential office will ultimately be blocked by factors beyond its control, the strength and resilience of the APRA's party organization through decades of proscription and repression will set the standard for how serious Latin American mass parties should organize themselves during the mid-20th century. Next, we will check back in on a couple of countries in South America where important parts of the old order have survived into the era of mass politics. We will watch as new parties push their way into the political arena, and we will also see activists continue to work inside some of the older parties that already exist in an attempt to reorient them from within. Then we will head north to a series of countries that have received much less coverage in this series so far. Most of these countries will face a much rockier road to mass democracy, and it will often take some sort of revolution or civil war to bring newer and more popular political forces into power. As the Cold War gets underway, the countries in the Caribbean basin will also face the additional complication of renewed military intervention by the United States. And many of the region's leading anti-imperialist parties will win power only to get overthrown a few years later by US military intervention. There is so much to cover during this era of politics that we are going to have to proceed country by country and at a much slower pace than in the past. But in the videos to come, we are going to visit nearly every corner of Latin America, and we are going to examine the region's era of mass politics in all of its complexity and contradictions.